What do you want the code word to be? What? No, your name. Oh. Well, it was corn this morning, so today it's going to be corn right now. Because yesterday was a different morning. I don't know. Word. It's going to be corn. Because that's what it was in environmental justice, and most of what you eat is corn, whether you know it or not. Which is wild. Share screen. Do, 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 do. It's 12:20. Guess I'm gonna start talking at you. Okay, so the syllabus is still functional, which is good, even though it's not completely accurate. And let me tell you the ways. Last time we finished, which was Thursday, November 3rd, we finished lecture 9.1. Today, what I'm going to try to do is just do lecture 10.1. So I might go a little bit quick, might not pause as often for discussion points. And then if I can pull it off, I'll try to do lecture 11.1 on Tuesday, because I've decided on Thursday the 10th, I'm canceling class because I have a doctor's appointment and I can't make it work otherwise. And quite frankly, it's not a time in the term when I should be making up new assignments. So it's what it is. I know you're heartbroken by not having to write 500 words or something. I know 500 is almost nothing, but it's beside the point. That's kind of how it's going to go down. Reflection paper 6 will still hold up though, no matter what. I think worst case scenario, I bump it back a week. And then we will be set to worst case scenario. If I have to, I'll cut this film. But yeah, we should be okay. Is everything functioning for you all? In terms of this course? Yeah. It's that point in the term. We're just bored again. Yeah. We're just trying to survive. Okay. And I forgot my clicker, so I'm going to kind of be stationary and stuck at this point. And more specifically, I forgot part of my clicker in the other room. Okay. So in this lecture, we're going to a degree talk about strengthening the safety net. That's at least the chapter it corresponds with. More though, we're going to be talking about economic systems, right? If you would have told me when I started my academic career that like people would actually, for real, not just hypothetically, be discussing socialism in the year 2022, I would have been shocked because of the accruing of basically propaganda in the United States during the 20th century. Now, and like the Berlin Wall fell more than 30 years ago now, right? That was an event of my childhood. You know how you remember the news when you were in 3rd grade? Like, I know vaguely that happened. That's kind of my relationship with the Soviet Union falling. I knew vaguely it happened, but I had no idea what it meant. I had a teacher in 3rd grade we were doing some sort of Olympics thing, and he informed us that Russia didn't exist anymore. And I remember thinking, that's not true, but not understanding how or why it wasn't true. He said, no, it's Eastern Europe now. I was like, no, I think Russia's still there. Anyway, so things have changed a lot. Things have changed a lot, and in ways that you may not even recognize or know. So now we are at this interesting point in history where we are able again to have conversations really in the way that we were having conversations as a society in the 1920s, which is kind of wild. The Cold War kind of paused the whole planet in terms of our evolution of thinking about economic systems. And now it is beneficial for us as a society, as a culture, as a whatever, to look at it, to look at these assumptions, to start to break down that old mindset of there's capitalism and then there's socialism and there's nothing in between. And that's what this lecture is about. So let's talk roughly about what economics are and what economic systems are. So as I mentioned, our national conversation surrounding capitalism and socialism has shifted wildly over the last 20 years. It was once taboo to even suggest that capitalism wasn't superior to socialism. That was enough to get you fired from a teaching position. I mean, for real. Most of that taboo was based on anti-communist sentiment during the Cold War. Reminder, the Cold War continued from 1947 to 1991, a very base level definition. It was effectively an international diplomatic conflict between the Soviet Union, now Russia, and the United States. And as a result of the Cold War, there were many what we called proxy wars. These conversations, though, about the relationship between capitalism and socialism, these conversations have been happening in Europe and a lot of the rest of the world for much longer than they've been happening in the United States. We are just now starting to have them in our society because finally that like kind of propaganda bubble has kind of dissipated, largely with your generation, to a degree also with my generation. And obviously it was strongest and most steeped with the boomers because their entire childhood and early adulthood was infused with it. There were two major turning points in the conversation. The first of which was Occupy Wall Street. How many of you have heard of this? Occupy Wall Street. Some, a little bit, right. It was an intriguing event. On September 17th, 2011, basically what happened was that, and it had been occurring for months ahead of that. I actually saw the activity behind the scenes on Facebook doing the organizing to this starting in about July of 2011, that there were these people saying, yeah, we're gonna go to Wall Street in New York City, we're gonna get on a bus, we're gonna do it in like mid-September, who's with us kind of thing, and then we're gonna occupy this area, this median in downtown New York City, and we're just gonna stay there as long as we can. And I was thinking immediately, like, you're gonna get arrested immediately. There's nothing gonna happen with this. This is nothing. This is wild. This is nonsense. More nonsense than most other activist activity I'd ever seen. I was highly skeptical. But it just so occurred on September 17th, 2011, that it converged. And what I did not recognize is the organizing power specifically of Twitter. That really, Twitter in 2011 was relatively new, and Occupy Wall Street did this. Are you familiar at all with a movement called the Arab Spring that happened in 2010? The Arab Spring happened in 2010, and then what happened was the activists in the United States and in Europe learned from that model of using Twitter, which was effectively on the ground organizers being able to send out kind of mass instructions to their people in a way that could not get entirely suppressed by either police or governments or whatever. It was highly, highly, highly effective, largely because Twitter worked a little bit differently back then, but also, I mean, you can still kind of do that via Twitter now. Just wondering, how many of you are actually on Twitter now? Wow, some, okay. A couple years ago, nobody was on Twitter. But you're on Twitter, so you know it's more of a one-way kind of social media as opposed to a two-way thing. At least that's how it was being used in 2011. It was a one-way, okay, my people take this action kind of thing. And what they did was then, by being able to do this, it was activist groups. To a degree, it was also union groups. They were able to direct these crowds in ways that basically the cops couldn't stop us, which was a major strategic issue prior to that with any social movement. For example, in the anti-war movement in the early 2000s surrounding the Second Iraq War, we had major difficulties in getting out our directions to people of where rallies were going to be without cops infiltrating us and stopping it before it could even start. That was a major issue. With Twitter, you can do that in like a second. And that's a major, major difference there. And then of course, though, because it was so new, authority figures weren't capable of counteracting it, right? They didn't understand what exactly was happening. So to show you and give you a concept, Occupy Wall Street was more than New York City. Occupy Wall Street was very much global. Now, take this with a certain grain of salt, because a lot of these dots, especially in the United States, are probably incredibly small towns with like 2 people at a demonstration, but they were absolutely widespread, these demonstrations. There were actually 2 factions in Columbus that were calling themselves Occupy Columbus. That's its own little bizarre story that someone should honestly write a book about. But unfortunately, I guess, Occupy Wall Street was completely non-hierarchical, completely. There were no central leaders, and a big part of the movement was trying to figure out how that would exactly work. And we did develop certain mode. Every Occupy Wall Street event was very much kind of a town hall event too, where we all collectively decided what was actually going to happen. And it was a very interesting, you could say, social experiment in non-hierarchical decision-making. That's something we were saying a lot then, non-hierarchical decision-making. But because of that, we developed no institutional memory, and there were no pushes and planning happening in a way that is enabled by actual leadership, right? So in most of these Occupy Wall Streets, they fizzled and crashed within a couple months once they lost momentum. And then also, very practically, once winter hit, right? Because most of this is in the Northern Hemisphere. Once winter hit, game over, especially in like Northern Europe, game over. So it's a short-lived movement, but it was intensely culturally significant because it did make social movements aware of the possibility of communicating via social media. BLM, the Me Too movement, those two movements would not have done it the way they did without kind of the infrastructure that was built by Occupy Wall Street in very interesting ways. And there still is an Occupy Wall Street organization specifically in New York City. I believe there's an Occupy Atlanta and Occupy Detroit are also organizations that have maintained and continued. And I'm sure there are others around the world. So it was very short-lived, but this is where our concept of the 1% comes from. It is. Before 2011, for many Americans to suggest that there was a power elite that controlled the vast majority of wealth in this society, you would be called either a conspiracy theorist or anti-American. One of those two insults would be thrown at you, because to even suggest that there was a hyper rich elite. If you know the term zeitgeist, our collective consciousness is a better word in English. It inserted this concept into our collective consciousness in a very interesting way. And then by doing that, it opened up a conversation that now in society, we are better able to talk about social inequality. It really punched a hole. How old were you in 2011? Amazing. Very interesting. Do you all know how much closer in age you are to my daughter than you are to me? Oh, my hernia. Okay, so prior to this moment, it just wasn't something we talked about. It simply wasn't something we could process. For those of you that remember your sociological theory from Social 101, this is a direct application of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea that you have to have a word for a thing to be able to talk and discuss the thing. That concept of the 1% was absolutely critical. Then Bernie Sanders came. His campaign, and Bernie Sanders had been calling himself a socialist for decades. And for decades, people went, okay, crazy communist grandpa, like, go over there. And no one thought he was going to get as far as he actually did. Yeah, he wasn't elected president, obviously he wasn't, we all know this now, but it looked like he really was going to. And just by talking about and using the word openly, socialism, even though he was working with the Democratic Party, that also shifted the conversation, right? It was no longer a slur to call somebody a socialist and to talk about these, oh my God, legalized marijuana, right? Universal health care, tuition-free public college, many of these things probably look pretty good to you, right? These were things that in the 80s, certainly in the 60s, you mentioned these things would get a stigma placed on you as being anti-American and maybe being a Soviet spy. Like for real, not just for real. People in the 50s in higher ed, in Hollywood, a lot of places were blacklisted for talking about these things, and which basically meant your career was destroyed. We've shifted very dramatically as a society, and I think we just don't quite talk about it. And part of the reason why the appeal of socialism is growing is because capitalist economies are prone to periodic instability. This is one of the components of elements of capitalism, is that it does tend to be more popular. Business tends to be more popular when everyone's making money, right?
Right now, we're probably, oh my God, I hope we're at a low point, right? But in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, the economy was surging. Joblessness was very low. Homelessness was mediumly low. And everyone was doing pretty okay. There were, and if this were a graduate level course, I definitely would assign one of these. There were very respected economists, people who were advising presidents saying that we were now in a, we were then now, right? We were now in a period where there will never be a recession again, and the economy is just going to grow forever. They were actually saying that and disregarding everything that economics and history had ever told us, which now we look at and say, yeah, that's idiocy. There were very smart people saying these things in the early 2000s because we were blind, because we were all doing really well, right? I mean, if you have your belly full of pizza and you're playing PlayStation, you're not going to question anything, right? Well, I mean, unless you're gluten intolerant or something like that. So, what is an economy? The basic definition of economy is a social institution that organizes the ways in which society produces, distributes, and consumes goods and services. Goods are stuff we make, right? Note that that definition doesn't mention money. Economists are most likely people who talk about distribution of money and how money works and does things. It doesn't have to be money. If you look at economies across human history, many of them did not include money. Many of them included, maybe if there was currency, it was maybe a currency that had some sort of intrinsic value. There were societies in the past that have used hunks of salt as currency. To put it to modern day prisons, there are prisons where prisoners use cigarettes as currency, where they use it specifically in the California penal system, and I find this very interesting. They use little tins of fish they call them macks, and they're like, I think they're mackerel, and they're canned fish, and everybody hates them, so they never eat them, but they can get them out of the commissary, and they do have a value to them, so they exchange them with each other for like drugs or whatever, right? Very, very interesting. We humans, we tend to create currencies, which is, it's intriguing. And largely that's because of our socialization. There are many ways that economies can be organized. In industrial and post-industrial societies like ours, though, we are living in the modern world. There are so many things, right, that you may want or need. And as such, we probably can't have a true barter economy because if you're a chicken farmer, people only need so many chickens, right? So we put together currency, and when using currency in the modern world, it's largely somewhere between capitalism and socialism. That's what it most often looks like. As Americans, we are and this comes back, I promise, we're typically very aware of our civil and political rights, right? This is something that we drill into you in elementary school, and we celebrate this stuff on the 4th of July, and everyone agrees that things like freedom of speech, especially freedom of speech and freedom of religion, are very important and powerful things. And we all kind of agree, even though sometimes we have certain disagreements, right? What exactly does that mean? And then when we start talking about right to bear arms, of course, there are definitely conversations and arguments that happen there. But as a whole, Americans, we do, when surveyed, the right to bear arms is nuanced. Most Americans agree that it's okay to have guns, but also most Americans agree that there should be regulations on those guns. So it's not as divisive as you actually think it is. And that divisiveness is largely a matter of politics, but of course. However, other societies have acknowledged that citizens have economic rights. And economic rights are those things that we have very much ignored in our society for a very long time. And sometimes when in our modern conversations, when people try to diminish what are called economic rights, they talk about entitlements or being entitled or whatever. That's kind of the modern parlance for talking down these things. But we're talking about things like a right to health care, a right to a job, a right to unemployment benefits, to old age pensions, etc. Can anyone tell me here, because I was a union organizer for a couple years and I truly did not understand this, and this is something unions make themselves very intrinsically interested in. What is a pension? Or how is a pension different from a 401k? Yeah.
Isn't a pension something that your employer pays into? So like typically people would stay at companies for a period of time and use either for kind of like their entire career, their entire life. And so based on years of service in that company, you would get either a certain amount of your paycheck or you get some type of like financial compensation when you retire. And then like 401k, isn't that more like, I mean, 401k you have to contribute to, you have to like either pay someone to invest it or invest in yourself, and then there's also options Roth versus non-Roth, and like how that happens. And some companies will match it to a certain percentage, but it's not as much.
Yes, so, and I'm gonna make this the very raw example, right? A 401k requires you to save, right? It's all on you. You save it because you're a good little worker, you're a good little American capitalist, and 401ks came to us at the very end of this whole, the concept is very much built in the 80s and 90s when people were still absolutely making out in love with capitalism, right? A pension is an older idea, came out of the union movements of the 20th century. The idea being, after I retire, and I have been with this company for 30 years, they are going to pay me, they're going to keep paying me because I gave my life to them, and they're going to keep paying me my income. And yes, maybe if I've only been with them for 10 years, they'll give me half of my pay, but it is a guaranteed pay every month from that company. That's what a pension is. Or in terms of national pensions, and what in the UK specifically, they use this term old age pension, and the government pays that. And it is sometimes based on what you did for a living, and then what you did for a living, you get a certain amount of money in your old age, and that's how that works. And have any of you who's ever gone to like a resort in another country? Were there a lot of Germans? Yeah, no? Where did you go? A lot of French? A lot of Germans? Yeah. You're gonna get some Europeans, right? Regardless, old Europeans, just flooded with them. Why? Because they're retired and they can actually afford to go like on these wild vacations, basically drawing the equivalent of our Social Security. But they're paid basically as if they're full-time workers still, right? That's what their society has that our society does not have. We made this decision as a society that we would just not do that, while they made the decision that we would do it. Why? Because that's communism. That's why. That's why we decided not to. So let me look at what my next slide is. Good. Okay, 1 second, coming back. Yes. So as I alluded to here, FDR's second Bill of Rights. There was a moment in our national history when we had a turning point and we were at the same point as the rest of society, as in the rest of global societies, right? Where our economy was structured very much like people in Europe, very much like most economies around the world. And then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, we will have a new Bill of Rights, a second Bill of Rights. And part of that was right to healthcare, right to a job, old age pensions, etc. That was in there, and we decided not to do most of it, but we did take some things and do that. And Social Security was one of those things. And at that time, Social Security was much more substantial. Now, as an old person, if you're drawing Social Security, it is usually enough to pay your food and usually not enough to pay your rent, right? It's to keep you from starving to death. That's not how it used to be. Social Security used to be much more substantial. When did that change happen? It happened in the 80s and 90s when we were in love with capitalism and we thought that the economy would always be going skyrocketing because we were incredibly short-sighted. And not me, not you, you didn't exist yet, and I was 8. What generation was that? Questions there? Other than screaming why? Greed is why. Short-sightedness is why. Capitalism then, what is this thing? What is this thing? Capitalism is the economic system based on certain ideas. These are the ideas central to capitalism. And people that like capitalism agree to this. Unregulated competition. A capitalist believes that the government shouldn't tell their business how to do their thing, usually. That's usually people that like this idea, what they say. The privatization of the means of production. I'm looking in this room, no one here has been in my Social 101 class, so I can ask you, what does that mean? The privatization of the means of production? Or what are the means of production? Yeah.
Means of production are like surface clothing. It's like all the sewing machines that make the clothes. So instead of the government owning like all those sewing machines, it's like one person or one company owning those sewing
Right. Right. So the individual owns the sewing machines, not the collective ownership of the means of production that we'll talk about in the next slide. So it's one guy owns it. A business has one owner or a small group of owners. That's how we think of business in the United States. There are businesses that don't do it that way, but that's the typical model. Production for a profit? We're running a business here. Your boss may have said, so we're running a business here. I don't care. We're running a business. It's production to make money. That's the mindset of how it operates. Maybe we want to do something to help our community, but we got to make money, right? That's kind of what's happening there. And then price being set based on supply and demand. If people are willing to pay the money, then we're going to sell it that much. That's that idea, right? As Americans, this economic system is the one we're most familiar with. This is most businesses, most organizations we interact with operate off these ideas. Even nonprofit organizations sometimes work off these ideas. What's the word that has been thrown around in social work world recently? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Something like entrepreneurship, but like I can't remember what the word was. It's gross.
Talking about this kind of entrepreneur?
Oh, no, pyramid scheme? No, I'm not talking about that. No, no, that's what it was though. Thank you. Social entrepreneurship is what they've been calling it, where basically they're trying to corner, instead of just giving nonprofits money, because God forbid, why would you do that? There are organizations advocating that, well, your food pantry just needs to open a restaurant next to your food pantry too. And through that restaurant, you can fund the food pantry, which can work, but then also you're creating a for-profit business. It's weird, but that's an idea that's being talked about within the nonprofit world right now. And it's been a conversation that's been happening for about the last 10 years or so. Then socialism then. Socialism is an economic system based on another set of ideas. They're different ideas. Capitalism came first. In the modern era, out of what was called mercantilism in the 1700s or so, this thing, and mercantilism, for as far as we're concerned, effectively was, we could just call it kind of pre-capitalism. That's all you need to know. But out of that came capitalism as we know it and all the ideas there. And then in the mid-1800s, there were a series of worker revolts and social movements where the ideas of socialism came out of. So many of the ideas generally associated with socialism are indeed addressing ideas within capitalism itself. Government regulation of the economy. So a socialist believes, or a socialist mindset would posit, that business can't be trusted. People will do some really gnarly things if there are no laws and there are no rules, whatever. Has anyone here read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair? Some? No? You can get, okay, so if you get your hand, first of all, the whole book is amazing. It's like one of my favorite books. But if you just want to read like the first 20 pages or so, because that's all most people actually remember, it's about the meat packing industry in Chicago at the beginning of the 20th century. And what resonates is that we eat meat. Most of us eat meat. And in that era, basically, people were selling garbage. They were putting literal garbage in sausages, like not just sawdust. Sawdust was like the least of it, but like parts of animals that are not food, just any junk that's on the floor and putting it in the sausages. And because of that, there were people, especially poor people, that were buying cheap sausages and dying because there was a screw in their sausage. Like just wild. Hey, do you know why you can't eat sawdust? Because it obstructs your bowels and you die a very painful death. That's why you can't just eat sawdust. That was happening. That was real. And what stopped that was the creation of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA exists to make sure people aren't selling food that isn't food. That's government regulation of the economy. And that is not a strictly capitalist concept. The collective ownership of the means of production, and excuse me for being a little bit brief here, because Marx dedicated thousands of pages to this concept. Yes, it is kind of the opposite of the private ownership of the means of production, but it can take many, many forms. The idea here being that those people who run the business should be the ones that profit from the business. That's the idea there. So instead of Mr. Johnson owning the sausage factory, I don't know why I'm on sausage right now. Instead of him running the sausage factory, the workers, we will run the sausage factory. And if there's a couple hundred workers who are operating the sausage factory, maybe we need to have delegates from various departments, right? And then that group of delegates will then vote on, say, when we raise sausage prices, how many sausages we make, etc. And then when the company makes profits, instead of Mr. Johnson pocketing all of it, we distribute it equally among all the workers, is how we work that, right? So you can really see that's really kind of socialism in a nutshell. Often people only talk about government in that regard of collective ownership of the means of production. And that is one way to do it. That is the way that the Soviet Union tried to do it and failed pretty remarkably at doing it. Because in that model, remember, and keep in mind what I just told you about, we are the workers at the sausage factory and we share ownership, right? That's collective ownership of the means of production. Here's how the Soviets fucked that up, basically. They said, okay, we've taken power. We are the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I can't remember, whatever. And we are the representative of the people. And we control the government. So therefore, the government is the people. So the government owns that factory. So by the profit of the factory going to the government, the profit of the factory is actually going to the people. No, it was broken. It was a very broken, very corrupt system. Marxian and Marxist critics of the Soviet Union have often called that state capitalism instead of collective ownership of the means of production. Another way collective ownership of the means of production can operate is a co-op, like a grocery co-op or a bakery co-op. Patty Cake Bakery up in Clintonville operates off a co-op model. To work at Patty Cake, they have to agree that, yes, we need another person. And then when you work at Patty Cake, you are a partial owner of the business. And everyone makes the same profit. There is no boss or owner of Patty Cake. The lady that actually founded Patty Cake, I used to know her better than I do. She's a great person. Name's Jenny. She didn't want to be a boss anymore. She didn't want to be a business person anymore. So she created a collective with the people who were already working for her. So when they made money, everyone made money, was basically the concept. So these models of collective ownership of the means of production, they exist in the United States. For sure they do. Usually they don't make loads of money, but they exist. And honestly, they're not super big because our overarching social structure, i.e. our government and the rest of our capitalist-oriented society, don't really allow them to grow and flourish the way they could. I can talk about this forever. Yeah.
I'm just confused if, like, I don't understand how that could apply to a bigger business just because don't you need like a manager or like someone to kind of like lead almost?
Yeah, so what would happen is, go back to the example of the sausage factory, they would have like delegates, like representatives elected from various departments. And then those delegates would be the people that make the decisions. And then maybe they would need to hire someone to organize operations, but that person wouldn't be the one to make all of the money. That would just be another employee.
So they make the same amount.
They would make the same amount of money. Or it could be different. It could be different amounts of money. It could be. A whole point of this whole lecture is it doesn't have to be. Can someone let that person in? I guess. Someone trying to get in. Oh, okay. Anyway, it doesn't have to be either or, right? And no economy is either or. Our society has capital socialist elements to it. It really does. So that's kind of the thing. Any other questions? Yeah.
It's kind of similar, but there's and the other question talked about like what animals genetic. Basically, there's like this basically exposed that the actually had a class in like they were like trying to actually feed it to the pigs, and then people would eat those pigs.
Yeah,
And when he posted, he got fired like 2 days after.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and basically, so we were in plastic.
Yeah, no. It's what we feed the animals that we eat is horrendous. It is horrendous. Have you ever heard of mad cow disease? Okay, I'll only be vague. Sometimes meatpacking plants, they think, how can we save costs? Well, we have all these dead animals and animal bones. Let's grind it up and feed it to the living animals. And that's where mad cow disease comes from. Because when you feed anything, something of its own species, usually it causes brain damage in the long run. So cool. Yeah, for sure. And that's a tale as old as time. And it's just like the jungle. It's a very old tale. There are a bunch of reasons not to be vegetarian, but I mean, there's a bunch of reasons to be vegetarian. There's only really a couple of reasons to not be vegetarian is because I really like meat. So what it comes down to. Production based on need. In a socialist model, you don't make something that's not needed. It just doesn't happen. Did you try to get in the back? No, that was me. Okay. We just had a back door. You don't make something that's not needed. You don't produce something that you know is going to break. There's an idea in IT called planned obsolescence. It's actually an idea in a lot of modern things. Look at the things that are in your possession right now. How many of those things will you have in 5 years? Probably not much, right? I mean, I need new shoes. I might have I hope I have my wedding, right? But like that's pretty much it. That's maybe this hat. What else? What's just this knife? The knife is. I mean, that's steel, right? Like that's not going anywhere. Yeah, that's planned obsolescence. In this model, if the Apple Corporation were being run from this model, we would not need new iPhones every couple years. We would have ways to take out the old chips and put in new chips to update our pre-existing old phone, right? That's how that would be. And if there was something that we knew just had to be remade over and over and over again, maybe we just wouldn't have that, right? And then finally, to go into the second one, prices based on labor put into a product. So things would cost a corresponding amount to the amount of work that some worker put into the product. That is why fair trade coffee is so expensive, is because it's not operating off capitalism, right? A lot of people have to be exploited and underpaid for you to buy a cheap cup or a cheap pound of coffee. Coffee is actually a relatively expensive product to make. So to pay everyone on that line, hypothetically, a fair amount, you do have to pay more for it. Any questions there before we move on? Okay. Point of clarification, socialism is not the same thing as communism. Different things, different things. Communism is both a government type and an economy type. So communist societies try to enforce socialism through their government, and they typically try to do that through force and authoritarianism. Authoritarianism basically being you do what the government says. If you don't do what the government says, you get locked up or shot, right? That's the very short of Communist societies typically outlaw private ownership of the means of production. So they typically make business the way we do it in the United States illegal. They strive to eliminate economic classes or economic inequality. So what they try to do is they try to basically get rid of the rich people in a number of different ways. You could imagine some of those are kind of unsavory. Cooperative management and distribution of goods and services. So the government takes over those components of distributing food, distributing pay, doing everything. So, and again, going back to Social 101, if you remember, they vary in bureaucracy theory with the ideal type and the real type, the way things should be and the way things actually are. Basically, what communist societies do, very hardline, very strict communist societies do, is they turn all elements of society into a bureaucracy, is what happens. And that's the major downfall of strict anti-democratic communist societies, is that it becomes impossible to get stuff done, basically. And you have to start bribing people to make them actually do their job properly. In the old Soviet Union, it was very common, if you wanted something to get done by a government official, you had to like do the equivalent of slipping them a 20 to do their job. That was like a common part of everyday life in the Soviet Union. And actually, I have an old travel guide to the Soviet Union from the 1980s, and it says explicitly, plan on a budget of how much you're going to bribe officials. It said it in the book. It's really amazing. Anyway, communist societies tend to de-emphasize the individual as well. That is very much part of the propaganda program. If they can get their people thinking, I live for the greater whole, I live for everyone, then we are going to actually keep going.
Is like the Chinese government, I know they're considered communist, but it doesn't seem like when they think of it, they still have like that micromanagement and all that.
That is amazing. I was thinking, it's like, are we okay? Like 5 people have left in like the last 2 minutes. Are we fine? Okay. Anyway, we're cool. Weird coincidence. No, they're not communist anymore. They call themselves communist. They're run by the Communist Party, but there's a lot of capitalism that happens in China. Apple wouldn't be Apple if it weren't for the Chinese government. Like, just all there is to it. A lot of people make a lot of money out of China. Arguably, if the Soviet Union still existed, it probably would look much more like China today. These things just, but they're on the spectrum of socialism to capitalism. There is no pureness to it, right? And that's how it was sold to us during the Cold War, is that you're either a good red-blooded American or you're a commie pinko bastard, right? There was no in between. That was what we call bifurcation. All bifurcation means is one of two things. That just is an old mindset that doesn't work if you're going to understand this phenomenon properly. Another point of clarification: National Socialists are not socialists. National Socialism is another word for Nazism. And I went on my tirade last time about Nazis. Hey, everyone, did you know, this is really cool, my noisiness about raging against the hate symbol over there, a student in one of my other classes, she knows the building manager for Haggerty, and she had it taken off. Hey, be noisy, you get things done. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Fascism is a militaristic ideology that stresses the right of the powerful to rule the world. So it is actually the exact opposite of a communist ideology. The communist, a pure. Communist ideology is all about serving everyone and kind of ignoring the individual. A fascist ideology says if you are powerful enough, if you are strong enough, if you are intelligent enough, you should be able to tell everyone else what to do, right? Fascism is by definition a militaristic ideology and says that if a society is stronger than another society, they should be able to dominate them. That's what the Nazis believed, and that's why they tried to take over the world, is what they did. National Socialism is another form of fascism, except it incorporates elements of socialism, but only for white people. This is rooted in history. During the time when the Nazis were coming to power in pre-Nazi Germany, socialism was a very popular idea. So they did what many political figures do, and they just throw words in there. So they said, yeah, we're national socialists. They weren't. They simply weren't national socialists. But eventually, they had to incorporate some of those ideas into their actual ideology. So what they said, they basically built up programs that would help people that they deemed to be quote unquote Aryan, right? So me, basically. Look at me, that's basically it. I'm like 80% German. This guy right here. Anyone even a little bit brown? No, basically. That's the concept there. Fascist ideology is inherently committed to inequality. Here is a link to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Southern Poverty Law Center is an amazing organization to teach you about hate groups. If you see some graffiti that you think that looks very suspicious, look it up on their website. These are currently being used hate symbols by white supremacists. Note this one, Rock Against Communism. Fascists often like to decry communism as part of their propaganda. A fascist believes that if they can trick you, they should be able to trick you because you're stupid. So therefore, and make you do what they want you to do. Very ugly ideology. Obviously, it's an ugly ideology. I mean, we know, yeah, it killed 6 million Jews, so obviously it's ugly. Well, if you look at the details of the ugliness of fascism, it's ugly for so many reasons. Wait, let me see. So this slide is actually better, and then I'll go back to the last one. There's a common misconception among Americans that socialism is inherently anti-democratic. Democratic governments can use both socialism or capitalism, and we do. We absolutely do. Anti-democratic governments can use socialism or capitalism, and National Socialism is Nazi stuff. Nazis are never right. This is a very good illustration of, have you ever heard of Popper's paradox? Anyone? It's a Philip, you have. What class? Philosophy, maybe? Government, maybe? Maybe in government. Okay, Popper's paradox goes as such. As lowercase d Democrats, people who believe in democracy, we are all, I think, we're all Democrats, even if we're capital R Republicans. We think we should vote for things, right? And that's how we solve things as a society. We vote for things. As Democrats, lowercase d, we believe that we should be able to debate any idea. And that sounds like a great idea, that we should be able to debate any idea. However, an inherent flaw to that is if somebody you are debating does not respect you and does not believe and sees debate as something that can only be won, and it is not a conversation, i.e. they're an extreme ideologue, right? They believe they are absolutely right no matter what. It can't work, right? So if people think their idea is ideologically pure, they are only right no matter what, and that you are stupid because you're not a fascist, it can't work. That's Popper's paradox. So thus, it serves no democratic free speech purpose to have a Nazi be able to speak on campus, because they are here to trick you. And also, if you aren't this guy ethnically, they think you're less than human. That's why that can't happen. Now, very interestingly, if you look up Popper's paradox, this is intriguing, you will see the Nazi stuff taken out sometimes. If you do a simple Google image search and then look a couple down, right? They will put hammers and sickles in there and take out the imagery of Nazism to make it an anti-communist thing, just to flip it on its head so that they can use it for their purposes. So they're saying they're making it about communism, not actually about fascism. That is also an example of a fascist attempting to trick you. With that said then though, and nuance is important, Popper's paradox does also apply to extremist communist ideas too. It does. It's not just about fascism, and it's not just about fascism, it is about any extreme ideology. It could be applied to religious extremists as well. It could be applied to any extremist that believes that only their group is the only right and just group. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah. Good. There was, before you all were in college, this was a big hubbub in terms of, should we allow Nazis to speak on campus? Fuck no! No! They're Nazis! We fought a goddamn war. Yeah.
When did Karl Popper say this kind of thing? Because there was that Nazi parade thing that happened in Chicago where they were like, please don't do that. That sounds horrible. And there was a lot of Jewish people.
I am not sure. I know it's 22nd. You're talking about the 70s, right?
I think so.
Yeah, the Nazi parade. I think this is a pretty old idea. I think this is like, we're talking like 1920s, 30s stuff. You know what? I think it's pre-Nazi Germany, actually. I think this is an idea that was before. We just don't listen to academics. That's basically what happens. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting slope, isn't it? I mean, a white nationalist is a Nazi. White nationalists believe only white people should be in charge. I mean, that's the thing, right? This is why we don't throw around words like fascism, because fascism is a right-wing ideology. You don't call Republicans fascists. They're not fascists, they're Republicans. But call fascists fascists. If somebody believes that they can trick you, if they believe that white people, if it's right, when it becomes racist, I guess, is really what we're talking about, and overtly racist. I think that's a pretty safe line in the sand, that we say genetically some people are superior to other people. I think that's a pretty good line in the sand to draw. Yeah, good, cool. I think, let me just look at my presentation. Jesus Christ, I thought I was almost done. I've been dropping the JC bomb a lot today. What does my previous slide say? It's a spectrum. I've been talking about this. The United States, we have libraries. Libraries are a socialist idea. Amazon would prefer libraries didn't exist because it takes a cut out of their book sales, right? They would prefer it didn't exist. The US Postal Service almost always runs at a loss. You do have to pay to send things, but it almost always, it's not a for-profit venture, actually. UPS and FedEx would prefer the Postal Service did not exist because then they could charge you more, right? Remind me, when are we done? 3:40? Okay, we're gonna be going the whole time.
I said it in 45, by the way. 1945.
He said it in 45? And then the war was the war done in 46 or 44? I think the war was done in 46. Yeah, so he did. What? He's German? Is he?
Well, Carl with a K.
Carl with a K. Maybe he's Dutch. Could be Dutch. Anyway, that's intriguing. Anyway, but Cuba now, they still are a communist government. They do have some small businesses now. They do a degree of tourism, mostly with Europe now. They have things that they use to make money. During the Cold War, that would have been completely taboo within their government. And actually, interestingly, Cuba only became communist because of the Cold War. Castro and his crew of friends, they really didn't have any ideological backing other than we hate Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba at the time. And basically, the Americans weren't interested in helping them, but the Soviets say, hey guys, and they gave them money. So that's why they agreed to it, because the Soviets became interested in Cuba because it was right off the coast of Florida and they could put missile bases there. That's a whole different ball of wax. So let's talk some about safety nets and economics. So, and the reason we tie this in then with safety nets and economics is the concept of a social safety net is an idea that does fall a little bit more on that socialist side of things. And during that time in our society, when we were so in love with capitalism, that's when we broke down those safety nets. Capitalism tends to minimize safety net provision programs, while socialism tends to encourage them. Safety nets serve basically as automatic economic stabilizers. That's not my term. I don't remember where I got it, but it's pretty good. So if you know anything about cars, you know that you need shocks in a car. If you don't have shocks in a car, it's going to be really shaky, right? And you're going to get hurt. Early Jeeps actually didn't have shocks in them. So you felt they could drive over almost everything and you absolutely felt it. So basically capitalism's like an old Jeep. Our text suggests that one way to fix poverty in the United States is to rebuild our American safety net. And then Rank suggests 3 ways that we should actually do that. So safety nets do tend to diminish in good times. And I alluded to that. From the 80s to about 2008, there were colossal diminishments in, that was when the welfare reform movement actually occurred. And at that time, as I alluded to, the economy was doing great. And I can't say it enough. There were actually smart people saying, capitalism is always going to keep growing no matter what, and we would always be rich. And I was yelling at that time, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And I hate being right, I guess. So programs that have decreased since the 80s are things like housing assistance, nutrition programs, including SNAP. Nutrition programs are those things that we call food stamps. Unemployment insurance. So your ability to actually keep getting paid some from the government after you get fired. But some programs have increased. CHIP. So this is a medical program for low-income children. CHIP was actually almost created during this welfare reform time because it was kind of part of the political give and take, right? So in the conversation, Republicans were saying we need to get rid of these things. Democrats were basically saying, well, what about kids? So part of the give and take was Republicans saying, okay, we'll create a program for kids. Now, can we get rid of the rest of it? Is basically how it went down. And then the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, created more safety net features relating to healthcare. Does anyone, any of you, you've lived your whole lives almost without it. Can anyone explain to me what a pre-existing condition was? This is the major achievement of the Affordable Care Act. Yes, it made it easier for people to get health insurance. Yes, the health insurance industry is still broken down, right? See, broken down, right? This right here would have been fixed by now. A pre-existing condition. Let's say you have high blood pressure. Your doctor dies and you have to go find another doctor. The doctor that diagnosed you with high blood pressure, well, you have to go to another doctor then. And the other doctor says, you have high blood pressure. And because the previous doctor diagnosed you with high blood pressure, then that means health insurance wasn't going to pay for high blood pressure from now on because it was previously existing. Yeah, right? Yeah.
I've also heard those like ancestry and DNA kits that everybody's been using, like you sign off that you like basically give your data to whoever, and the companies will sell that data to insurance places so that they can like.
There is some concern there. As a amateur genealogist, I was very interested in that for a while. When you're doing all that, there are parts of it you can say, I opt into this, I opt out of that. And there were actually in the early 2010s, some laws passed to restrict some of that, but it is of concern. It absolutely is of concern. While pre-existing conditions existed though, they could make that argument. Hypothetically, there could have been a worst case scenario surrounding genetics technologies where people could say, well, this baby is genetically predisposed to high cholesterol, so therefore we will not pay for their cholesterol medicine. That hypothetically could have been possible when pre-existing conditions were still a thing. OSU, our health insurance that we had here through WellsCare was making the argument while I was trying to organize a union here that they would not pay for birth control because being a woman was a pre-existing condition. Isn't that cute? Yeah, for real. Yeah, that's how busted the system was. And so the Affordable Care Act, it did good things. It probably saved my friend Lauren's life, who has Crohn's disease. Additionally, welfare reform measures heavily emphasized marriage and disincentivized out of wedlock childbearing, which is highly problematic. So they wanted to encourage people to have kids, right? These were disproportionately aimed at African-American communities due to socioeconomics. The propaganda of that era, when they talked about people on welfare, they were assuming you assumed they were talking about Black people, is really what they were talking about. The philosophical question is, should we be punishing women for choosing to have children while they are single? Effectively, the stipulations of those welfare reform measures made it so that you as a single woman would be punished for having kids and not being married. And now we're in an era where abortion is harder to obtain too. Those two things don't go together. Disadvantaged minority groups are less likely to live in nuclear families. Thus, this disproportionately punishes non-whites. We know what we mean when we talk about a nuclear family. Mom, dad, kids. Mom, dad, kids of their own, no grandpas, whatever. That is the most common form of family among white people. Immigrant populations and certain other minority populations, that is not, it's more common to live in what are called extended family living situations, where grandpa or an uncle or somebody is also living with them. And in that situation, when it's not mom, dad, kids, it screws up the calculations, basically, of welfare reform, and it can take money away from you. And the policy makers were fully aware of that. There's very good documentation showing that. So if we're talking about how safety net programs change, benefits were slowly reduced, not all at once, but over time they were reduced. Limits were put into place on how long people could receive benefits. Programs started to incorporate job requirements. So it used to be that you could just be on unemployment for a period of time. Now you have to provide very detailed documentation that you are indeed actively seeking a job, which, if you're trying to get an education instead of actively seeking a job, that could be something you're doing to try to further your career, but it doesn't work that way. What if there are no jobs? That welfare reform was put into place in a time when there were jobs everywhere. Actually, right now, that's not really a problem. But if you're in a situation, what if there are no jobs? What if the jobs suck? What if the jobs are bad? What if they're jobs you don't want to do? And what if it makes more economic sense for you to take care of your kids instead of paying for childcare? We've talked about that before. And additionally, it created a disincentive for childbearing. Basically, the more kids you have, the less payments you get over time, which is, it's busted. So this is pulled from page 121 of our book. And sorry. I don't like using direct quotes. Some of you know this because of comments I make on papers. I don't use a quote longer than 3 lines, and if you do that, only do one per page, paper max. But here's a direct quote. A traditional issue with examining how safety net programs affect low-income families is whether these programs discourage work and hence increase the proportion of families with very low or zero earnings, and whether those programs encourage the formation of single-parent families. The evidence showed that neither work disincentives nor family structure incentives are large in magnitude, especially in the aggregate. What does that mean? All of these measures were put into place with very, very little evidence backing them up because no one listens to social sciences. We just do things that sound good politically, unfortunately. So fix number 1 could be that we could centralize and fund the safety net itself. I'm just going to work through these things because we have a couple minutes. You can read the slide yourself. You have the slides. Fix number 2 would be asset building. So we could actually create programs within our government that will build structures that will build more jobs. We could pay with government money to build a steel mill and then produce steel, and then even give that steel mill to a private owner. We could do that too, right? We could do all sorts of things. Have you ever heard of the New Deal? There was a program called the New Deal, also under FDR. And what he did was they created large-scale government programs that gave people work and then also created facilities that people would work in. That wasn't called, well, in its day, it probably was called socialist. But a lot of our infrastructure we have as a society now still, it was built during the New Deal. Most of you, or at least half of you, probably went to elementary schools that were originally made and then refurbished in about the 80s during the New Deal. Like that's for real. Schools weren't really made out of cement before the 30s. Like They were like wooden schoolhouses before that point. Unfortunately, though, many programs do primarily benefit middle and upper middle class people. Many of our programs still do not actually directly benefit the poor. And you see this in political literature. You absolutely see people are not talking about poor people, they're talking about the middle class, sometimes the working class. They almost never say, this is how we're going to help poor people. That is just politically not useful. And that's also a very deep problem we have in our society. Okay, I kind of got through this lecture, so we're still kind of on point. We will have class Tuesday, won't have class Thursday. The end. I could also end with amen, but I'm not going to. I mean, you know, it wouldn't be appropriate.